Interviewing people. Well, let's talk a little about interviewing people. Interviewing people can be difficult, especially at first. The best answer to this, or the best thing about I can say about interviewing people, is practice makes perfect. I mean, writing is a craft, interviewing is a craft as well. Talking to people and getting information is a craft, and the best way to become a good craftsman is to do it over and over again. You learn how to put together words as a writer. You learn how to put together questions, how to interact, how to feel people. And I want to make, I haven't really said this, but, keep in mind, writing is a craft. Just like a woodworker or somebody who, builds, chairs, it's a craft. The first two chairs they built were probably not that great. Nobody, the greatest chair builders, some of the greatest furniture makers, were probably worked with somebody else and made their share of mistakes and had the fair share of their work is in a fire pit, and they probably don't have a lot of stuff, but the people who are really good are ones who have persisted and done it over and over again. They learned the feel of the saw or the lathe or the sander and how it feels when they make contact, and how the turning and how everything, and their hands develop a memory on that. And so the case is the same thing happens with reporting and interviewing, everything else. You learn these skills. Practice makes perfect. Now, as you go interviewing, the first thing I say is do your homework. If you're going to go to an event, suppose for example, suppose there's a new restaurant opening here in town, and you work for the radio station, TV station, and you've been sent out there to cover it. Well, chances are you're going over there to do a story about it, and probably the place that has brought you has maybe sent over a press release or sent you an email with information. So you should make sure to read all that. The other thing you should do is to say go look through the library or morgue. Well, what does that mean? Well, to begin with, the library is actually the idea when back in the day. I should start by saying back in the day, like a newspaper or TV station or everything would have librarians, and they sometimes called these places the morgue. And it would be where they put dead stories or stories that have been finished. They called it the morgue, and it was usually like a library of some sort. But what they would do is, like, for example, in a newspaper, what they would do is, when a story was written, somebody would be charged as a librarian to cut the story out. And when they cut it out, they would then go through and they would circle every name in the story. And then what they would do is, if there were 12 names, they would cut out the story 12 times, and they would circle the name in a different name, each version of the story, and they would then take the one that was, had Lisa Lanigan in it, and they would put it in a folder with Lisa Lanigan's name on it. And if there were other stories with her name on it, then they would know, oh, okay, these are other stories about this same person, and so, then there would be a whole folder with stories about her in it. And that way, if somebody ever wanted to do a story about Lisa Lanigan and her involvement in the community, they would have it. And they would, or if suppose Lisa Lanigan got arrested for something, they could go back and find it. And they'd find, well, she was interviewed in 1986 about some story about, about her marriage. And now she just got arrested for killing the person. That's great. I got a story about what she feels about marriage. I can quote her from that previous story. And so they would have this. But what happened was they actually had to have librarians who would sit there, and every single name they had to circle. Every single institution, every single street. That way, if you had a story about something happening at the corner of Clear Lake and Madison, Clear Lake and Stevenson, something like that. You could say, if you had something about that, you could then have anytime something was going to happen at that intersection or on that street, you could look at the history of things that had opened and closed. If they opened a new restaurant on Stevenson, and you could look in the file and see everything that ever happened on Stevenson. You could find all the old restaurants, and you could do all kinds of things. And so that was the way it was done. Fast forward to today, we have a thing called Google and other search engines, and we can simply put all our stories into the computer, and then we can keyword search them, and we can find it. But the key is, is, for example, if they're opening a new restaurant, you might want to, Google the people in the store. You might want to Google the restaurant, but you'd also want to look through your own corporate files to see what stories have been done about that restaurant, about the people involved in the restaurant, because you never know what you're going to find. You might find, oh, there used to be a version of this restaurant. Well, that's a good question to ask. You might find out the person involved was previously a chef at a restaurant that, was mob related. Okay, well, you might want to ask about that. You never know what the case might be. And, you're doing your homework is going to help it. There might be a story about the person having a passion for a certain type of food. Great. You can have follow-up questions about that. And so make sure to do your research, know as much about the place and people before you go in. As you get better and better at doing this, you will maybe be able to, not write so many questions in advance of your interview, but you should never stop in doing all your research because, you're getting there, you're going there, you're getting a chance to talk to people. Your best bet to get the best information and to get the best quotes and to get the best story is to have found out as much beforehand. That way when you sit down with them, you can get the best information. And the case is the person's excited about opening up this restaurant. They're wanting to talk about the restaurant. If you found out that they had been written about, a column about their food, and they had been a food columnist for the newspaper for years, they might not even bring that up when you're there. But you might want to bring it up because you might want to say, hey, remember all these recipes you got from this person? Well, guess what? They have a restaurant now. That kind of thing. Now, I guess I'll just go through. Write down key questions, even if it's covered like in a PR guide or an email or something that they sent you. Still write down questions about those things. It's always better to get somebody to tell you and to make sure that that information is correct. So always, even questions like that, I would just say, it's in the PR guide, but let me just make sure all this is correct. So make sure kind of to have that listed, even if you know it, or even if it was in the email, say, I just want to go through this to make sure it's right. That's always a good thing to keep in mind. When asking questions, always ask open. Don't ask yes or no questions. Yes or no questions get you yes or no answers, and yes or no answers don't get you quotes. Ask questions like, instead of saying, are you, it's a restaurant, instead of saying, it says, your prices will be such and such, say, can you tell me about your pricing? Instead of saying, are you going to have outdoor seating, say, instead of saying, are you going to have outdoor seating, say yes, yes or no, you say, would you like to offer outdoor seating? And they go, yeah, we're going to. And say, oh, well, why? Try to follow it up with why. Try to get more information. Always be doing it. Another thing is, make the people as comfortable as possible. The case is that the better information you get out of people are people who are comfortable and are willing to answer your questions. I say make them as comfortable as possible. As an example of this, I will say that as a general rule in my life, one of the things I've known and learned is that people are willing to talk about pretty much anything. And if you go in, you get comfortable and you're nonchalant and you just start kind of not even poking that hard around the edges of something, people a lot of times will tell you stuff that you just never realized they would tell you. And it's kind of one of those things like, that's kind of the skill you want to go. Get them comfortable, just sort of poke around the edges and people will talk. But the key is to make them comfortable, make them think, you're there. It's hard to make people comfortable when you're sitting there with a recorder and a pen and paper and you're writing down everything they say, but that would be my suggestion. Don't ask leading questions. I'll give a few of these here. Get personal and take notes on everything. Don't ask leading questions. I say don't ask leading questions because, the problem is if you even if you already know the answer, even if you already know these things, try to avoid questions that, will lead them to a specific answer. Try to ask questions as generally and not just assuming the answer. Oh, you must really like cooking. And they'll just be like, yeah, I like cooking. Instead of asking them if they, why they're going to the restaurant business, just say, so why open a restaurant? Just be as general as possible. Don't try to get them to give specific answers because they'll give them to you. It's somewhat better just to get them to get talking. Get personal. Don't be afraid to ask them about their past, about their personal life, about their family. They may not want to answer it, but sometimes you'll find some of the best answers and some of the most interesting things. Like sometimes you'll say, oh, okay, well, was your dad a chef? Did your dad own a restaurant, or were your parents much of cookers, or did your wife, your husband? Find out about their husband and family, their wife, etc. Ask about their kids. You might find out, maybe they'll end up saying, if you start asking them a little bit about their family, you might find out that one of their kids died, or their wife died, or one of their, and that's sort of why they're going into the restaurant business. Suddenly you've got a story that, is kind of a lot more human interesty than before, whereas instead of just a restaurant opening, you've got a person whose spouse died and suddenly they decided to open a restaurant because that was their lifelong passion, and they wanted to do what they wanted to do. They realized life was short and they might as well do it. And you get them talking about that, you've got a great story. Take notes on everything. Take notes on where you're at, take notes on their thing. But watch their personal cues. If they're making faces, use that as well. I see you kind of grimaced. Why? Do that kind of thing. But the other thing I would say is take notes on everything. And the reason I say that is, you will quickly forget things. Make sure you're taking notes, and make sure you're watching for everything and keeping an eye out for everything. The best thing to do is you go in with pre-written questions, but be willing to rewrite them and be willing to observe everything you can. The case is sometimes you go in and you have one set of things and you find another one. I'll give you a quick story. One time I was interviewing for a job with a newspaper as to be like a city editor, which would be like the person in charge of sort of the newsroom, right below the managing editor, where kind of the day-to-day, kind of a pretty key position in a small newsroom. And I was interviewing for this job, and I think they called me, I think, to see if I was interested, and I think I called them and just told them I wasn't, but because my wife had no interest in moving to where the newspaper was. Anyway, but the case is that that one of the things I was talking about with the guy was when we were there was he said, he was trying to get his younger reporters, and one of the things the city editor would be doing would be coaching younger reporters, and the editor was saying with coaching these younger reporters was saying, he sent this guy out who was like passionate about dogs, not dogs, like he had show dogs, and he would take and show them at different events, and take them out to like like the what's that group, the kennel clubs and stuff, and they would run around the dog, Westminster Kennel Club, and they run the dogs around, best of show. He was really passionate. I think he'd gone to the Westminster Kennel Show. So this guy spent a lot of time training his dogs, grooming his dog, going on trips to dog shows and stuff. And they took a few pictures of the man at these events, and when he had this whole profile about the guy, he said, so what's his wife think about it? And the guy goes, the reporter said, I don't know. And he said that was kind of an example where the reporter didn't even think to ask the guy about his wife. Well, why is that important? Well, because, the thing about wives is and the thing about husbands is your spouse starts spending a lot of money and time doing something, and a lot of times they get annoyed about, the fact you're spending lots of time, money, and energy traveling all over doing this. So it's kind of important to know what the spouse thinks. And so, you have to be willing to kind of go in there and suddenly you go, hey, I wonder what their spouse thinks. Or to walk in, and he said, the thing that tipped him off to ask that question, the reporter, was as soon as he saw the photos, he looked at the guy in the house with the dogs, and it was clearly a house that was one in which he saw a woman's touch. I mean, men tend to keep their homes differently than women. They don't tend to put flowers out or have all kinds of little doilies and other things. I mean, those are kinds of, touches that men typically don't do. And so, there was clearly a woman's touch in the house he could see in the photos, and he wanted to know what the wife thought of it. And so the reporter's like, well, I don't know. And so he told the reporter, he said, oh, well, I know this guy. And his wife died. And I think that's why you may be doing it. And the reporter's like, really? He said, no, I don't know that. But I'm still wondering why you don't know if his wife is alive or dead. And that's probably a good question. I mean, things like that should be pretty clearly answered by the time you get done.